Daniel N. Jones is currently an associate professor of management in the College of Business at the University of Nevada, Reno, UNR, and a core faculty member in the Interdisciplinary Social Psychology program. Prior to UNR, Dr. Jones was an assistant professor of legal psychology at the University of Texas, El Paso. He received his Bachelor's of Science in Psychology from Stockton University and PhD in Social Personality Psychology from the University of British Columbia in 2011. He has published more than 90 peer-reviewed journals and chapters, many in flagship journals such as Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, Journal of Business Ethics, Psychological Science, and Perspectives on Psychological Science. He received the Early Career Award from the Western Psychological Association and has received several grants for research on dark personalities as they pertain to topics such as betrayal and cybersecurity. His research focuses on models of long-term versus short-term deception and harm. Most especially, this research focuses on the differentiation of the Dark Triad of personality: Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and narcissism. He is currently examining the potential utility of the Dark Triad in different contexts and is developing interventions that are designed to prevent the harm they cause. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Jones.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. Let me just walk you briefly through the outline of what I'm going to talk about. The first thing I really like to touch on is just some of my general background and what got me into cybersecurity. Got my PhD in personality social psychology, which is a bit of a distance from traditional cybersecurity folks, and just generally what I've done in cybersecurity up to this point. At that point, I'm going to launch into our preliminary study that we've done on phishing vulnerability, and I'm going to introduce you to the concept of overclaiming, and then we'll talk about phishing insecurity and poor cyber knowledge as being kind of a trifecta of phishing vulnerability. And then I'm going to introduce you all to, something that's over 60 years old, actually, an inoculation approach from communications theory, and how we can screen for people who potentially need this novel approach to cybersecurity defense. Okay, so like I said, of broad interest to me, the types of things I do relative to cybersecurity. I am a Dark Triad researcher. Initially, I worked with Delroy Paulus, who is the Dark Triad guy, as my mentor. And I first I was really interested in kind of attacker strategies. I've developed a deception model called Mimicry deception theory, and I've integrated some of those models into cybersecurity attack and defense as well. Naturally, I'm interested in phishing vulnerability and phishing styles, persuasion and inoculation, and then I've done some stuff with insider threat and manipulation as well. So these are kind of the 5 overlapping streams of research I have relative to cybersecurity. So my general interest in cybersecurity started while I was at the University of Texas at El Paso, and I had a wonderful colleague named Ashley Bangert who was in the psychology department, and her husband was in computer science, and his name was Chris Kiekenfeld, and she was always going on about Chris's work on game theoretic algorithms and security and things like that. And I was like, God, I gotta meet him, Ashley. And so finally she set up a meeting, and sure enough, we got together. And Chris is just amazing and really one of these guys that knows it all, knows the cybersecurity, knows the computer science and the math. And so we wound up getting together and got an Army Research Laboratory grant, defeating the Dark Triad using game theory. And a whole bunch of publications have kind of come out of that grant. And we also, through that grant, met Cleotide Gonzalez. And so my grad student and I, Shelby Curtis, have a paper on phishing attacks and defense with her. So I just want to briefly overview the Dark Triad because I'm going to use this term throughout the talk, and I just want to let you all know what I'm talking about. It refers to a cluster of 3 intercorrelated toxic personality traits of Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and narcissism. They are all callous and they are all dishonest. And that is more or less what they have in common. Besides that overlap, they have unique features. And, they are not a comprehensive list. There are probably more callous and manipulative personality traits out there, but these are generally the 3 most studied. And what's important when it comes to cybersecurity is that they have unique components. So Machiavellianism has kind of these unique components, but strategic, overconfident, and then as you see psychopathy, they're impulsive. And these unique components, so they're all willing to do engage in criminal behaviors, dishonest behaviors, harmful behaviors. So that gets them in the door for cyber attacks in the first place, right? If you're a very strategic but good-hearted person, you're unlikely to be committing any kind of cybercrime. So all of them are callous and manipulative, but then they take on these flavors of callous manipulation. And so Macs are strategic, and psychopaths are impulsive, and narcissistic individuals overconfident. And that leads them to engage in specific types and approaches to cybercrime. And then, of course, sadists, which, if anybody's interested in studying sadism, let me know, because they're the ones that disrupt things for the fun of it, which is a whole other bag of fun. So resource control research, what we've done from the Army Research Lab was a modified flip-it game. We found that Machiavellians, not surprisingly, performed the best against computer-generated algorithms. They were the most strategic, and the algorithms really tripped up high psychopathy and narcissism folks. And Macs behaved the most rationally. Okay, so let me just talk really briefly about mimicry deception theory as well. All types of organisms, from bacteria to plants to humans, deceive. There's beautiful virology literature and stuff on how they deceive host organisms. And the deceptions cluster in ways that parallel human deception. And I argue for long-term deception to emerge, there must be 4 components, and that is complex mimicry, slow resource extraction, integration into a community, and low detectability. And what we've done, and again, the talk is not a mimicry deception theory, I'm just giving you an overview of some of the stuff I've done. What we found is that these patterns hold when it comes to system infiltration. Long-term mimics and Machiavellian individuals were the most likely to approach system infiltration in stealthy or programmatic fashion, kind of sniffing around and doing kind of step-by-step processes, where short-term mimics and those high in psychopathy were most likely to use brute force attacks when and this was a paper we published in Computers and Human Behavior, if anybody's interested. So one of the things that segues into the stuff I'm doing now has to do with some of the past phishing research we did with Cody Gonzalez. So we found that different approaches among the Dark Triad and phishing emails, again, not surprisingly, Macs make more changes and do more things to try to get past end user suspicion and phishing spam filters. But in responding to phishing emails, we also studied the Dark Triad, and we found that narcissism, they did really badly at this. And it was interesting, there was a marginally significant dyadic effect, such that when narcissistic individuals were being phished by narcissistic individuals, they were particularly vulnerable to responding poorly to the phishing email. So that was kind of one of the origins of today's topic. And so I was on a collaborative call for the NSF, finding new collaborators, and I wound up virtually bumping into this guy, Rakesh Verma, who's at University of Houston, brilliant guy, studies phishing, natural language processing, machine learning, and other kind of alert systems in cybersecurity. And so he and I wound up chatting and got together and said, hey, let's launch something. And so after many rounds of discussion, we got particularly interested in this concept of overconfidence. Okay. Overconfidence. So, I've talked to a lot of cybersecurity experts on this, and it's notoriously difficult to define. What do you mean by overconfidence? Is it the person says they can do something, and if they can't, then it was overconfident. If they can, then it was accurate confidence. It seems like Monday morning quarterbacking to a lot of people. What we wanted to know then over these rounds of discussion was a little more specific. Is there a way to know when somebody claims to know something that they do not know, that they could not know? As it turns out, yes, there is an operational approach to defining this. So I'll walk you through overclaiming. So which of these concepts do you know? And I can't see all the audience members here, so don't shout it out. But most of you, I'm sure, are nodding when I say, do you know what a zero-day attack is? Do you know what fuzzing is? What about spindle transformations, if anybody knows spindle transformations? APT, or advanced persistent threats, or clickjacking. Well, if you said spindle transformations, you're full of crap. I made it up. It's a fictional concept that I Googled and made sure it didn't exist. And what we know empirically then, objectively, is that people who claim to know, I'm well-versed in spindle transformations is lying to you. They don't know spindle transformations because it's not a real thing. So overconfidence overclaiming uses a signal detection theory scoring that breaks a response into one of four categories, which is true hits, I know it, and yes, it does exist. True rejections, I don't know it, and you're right, no, it doesn't exist, we made it up. False rejections, which is saying I don't know it, and yes, it does exist, which implies that you're not as knowledgeable. And then, of course, there are false alarms, which is the most interesting, when people say, I know it, but no, you don't. I made it up. Okay, so the primary measure of overclaiming that we use in the studies that I'm going to be talking about is D prime, which is a measure of discrimination between true and false concepts. Now, it is possible for somebody to claim to know nothing, and then we'd be worried about knowledge insecurity at that point. But if somebody claims to know everything, that's what we're interested in, is people who say, yeah, no, I know that, and I know that, and I know that, and some of those things are fictional. Okay, so you get a measure of knowledge. Accuracy, so overclaiming, if you regress out some of these false items, you get a general idea for what somebody really does know. But then you get a measure of knowledge exaggeration as well. Okay, so overclaiming, just briefly, has been used in the literature. It was created, again, by my brilliant mentor, Del Paulus. And he found originally that it correlates with narcissism and self-deceptive enhancement. We've done some work on business overclaiming. Since I'm in a management program, it seems appropriate. And we found that it predicts self-centered thinking and self-centered sales approaches. And I did a study a couple of years ago showing that if you overclaim religious passages from a holy book, you tend to be more likely to be a terrorist. You're more sympathetic to terrorist ideology, and you're more aggressive in the name of God. And we did this in Christians living in the United States with the Christian Bible, finding people who claim to know biblical stories that don't exist were actually terrorist sympathizers. And we replicated that with a sample of Iranian Muslims with the Holy Quran, and we found exactly the same thing. What we found was actually people who know their Quran, people who know their Bible, are the most peaceful of all. People who overclaim the Quran or overclaim the Bible are actually the ones that are of concern. But there are some controversies that come with overclaiming. One is that people are just saying this is creativity. If you can think creatively about, well, maybe I've heard of that concept, let me wrap my head around what it could be, that actually accounts for overclaiming. And then there's some research showing that careless responding to surveys do this. Now, in all the surveys we do, we include attention checks and things like that. The careless responding argument is really tenuous at best. The openness to experience is something that we are beginning to control for in all that we do. But the biggest criticism I would say that overclaiming faces, and this is something we're tackling in my lab right now, is it's an unspecified mechanism. It's overconfidence-ish is how I'd put it. I wouldn't say it defines overconfidence. I wouldn't say overclaiming really is its own thing. All right, so now that we understand what overclaiming is and we have an idea of, everybody here knows about phishing, so here's the question, is this overconfident flavored overclaiming paradigm, is it related to phishing vulnerability? Okay, so we did a survey, and I've done statistical interactions between the business and engineering students, and there really was no difference, so I collapsed across about 320 students at UNR, and we included measures of Big Five, Dark Triad, knowledge and security, cyber measures, and cyber overclaiming. Okay. And then we had a standard phishing paradigm that I borrowed from Rakesh, who had it shovel ready, which just basically gives people a mix of phishing emails, and we ask them, 1, respond immediately, and 5, delete and block the sender. Okay. And so here are some of the specific measures we used. Surprise, surprise, Dark Triad, other than narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and the Big Five didn't do anything, so I'm not going to discuss those. We used the MPI 13, which is a validated short form of narcissism, and here's some sample items. And then what we did, and this will come up again later in the talk, was to look at knowledge and security. We asked people about Cialdini's 6 persuasion principles. So there's been a lot of research showing that reciprocity, liking, authority are ways we can cluster phishing attacks. And so what we did was we asked individuals how vulnerable they would be to these 6 types of attacks. So that is kind of a measure of insecurity. We also had a measure of cyber behaviors and cyber hygienes. So just basically questions that hopefully most of us would answer properly to. things like downloading sites from unfamiliar sites or looking for padlock sign, looking at the HTTP, things like that. And then we had our overclaiming questionnaire, which had things like legitimate concepts and fictitious concepts. Okay, so what did we find? First, we found that there were 4 significant correlates of phishing performance. So higher positive correlations meant better performance. So we replicated our findings from Cody Gonzalez and all that narcissistic individuals do indeed do worse. Vulnerability, so the higher they felt they were, more they felt they were vulnerable, the more poorly they did. Computer knowledge, the more they knew about, looking for padlock signs and things like that, the better they did. And accuracy, which is the D prime, which is basically the inverse of overclaiming, also significantly predicted performance. Now, these are fairly weak correlations, so nothing that we're going to go, saying this accounts for the universe of phishing vulnerability. In a simultaneous regression, narcissism got knocked out. So overclaiming, computer knowledge, and self-reported phishing vulnerability remain significant, all unique predictors of phishing vulnerability. Okay, so to summarize this part, basically, we also asked an exploratory question which leads to kind of our next step, which is, would you like to learn more about cybersecurity? Okay. And we found narcissism is kind of negatively related, but in particular, narcissism can be broken down into three components. So there's leadership authority, there's grandiosity, and there's entitlement. And we found that this leadership authoritativeness predicted negatively wanting to learn more about cybersecurity. So one of the questions that we got interested in then is, how do we reach out to those who think they know it all? Okay, and the reason why we believe that overconfidence, or again, I use that term with an asterisk, that this overclaiming paradigm predicts cybersecurity problems is because they think they would know a phishing attack if they saw one, and this overconfidence becomes really toxic, and it's a unique component. It's not the same as this admitted insecurity or vulnerability, and it's not the same as cyber behaviors. It's unique in a regression. So how do you fix this? And it became a real point of discussion between Rakesh and our group is, okay, so with the knowledge insecure people, or the people that don't know to look for the padlock signs, that seems pretty straightforward. You teach them. But it seems a little more complicated with people who think they know it all. So fixing the issue is a little more complicated among the overclaimers. Okay, so cyber behaviors, education. Phishing vulnerability, learn those Cialdini principles. Learn to recognize what a liking and a consistency and all those types of attacks are. But overclaiming is a lot trickier. And, I go back to, I have a cousin that works at Google, and he and I share cybersecurity notes. And one of the things that he has repeatedly said is, our top guys, every once in a while, and it's always the arrogant ones, they get phished. And so how do we fix this? One approach is inoculation. We have inoculation on the mind right now because of COVID, and I'm not talking, although that would be wonderful if we could just inject people with knowledge through a needle. But no, I'm talking more about the communications theory started by McGuire in the 60s. Psychological inoculation, according to McGuire, is where you just give a weakened argument to people, and then you let them naturally refute it, organically, internally refute it. And then once the real argument is present, the individual then knows to reject it. Now, inoculation has a couple of key parameters surrounding it. The first is that the system has to detect a threat. So I'm working with Josh Compton at Dartmouth on some other projects related to inoculation. And one of the things that he indicates is that you definitely need to, get the system to recognize there's a threat involved. And then the other thing that's really key is to make sure that individuals have a favorable attitude a priori to what you're trying to do, right? So presumably overconfident or overclaiming experts in cybersecurity would have a favorable attitude towards rejecting phishing emails. So that's good. That from the start, we know that most people would acknowledge that falling prey to phishing is bad. So, and then they would recognize it's a threat. So we have the kind of initial parameters needed to engage in inoculation type manipulation. Okay, so if we look at this parallel more deeply, then the idea parallels a virus, right? The weakened argument is therefore the inoculation, and then counter arguments that are naturally occurring within the individual's mind is a parallel for the antibodies. And if we see these parallels emerge, we can see how inoculation operates. But inoculation to what? So again, we are leaning heavily on Robert Cialdini's 6 strategies that individuals use to persuade. And for those of you who may have trouble remembering them, just think rascals. You're a rascal for trying to manipulate me. So this is reciprocity. Reciprocity is where individuals have a natural give and take. So I offer you something and I expect something in return. So phishing email of reciprocity would be, we're offering you this, but you need to sign in, log in, or do this thing for us. Authority, of course, is, this is the FBI and there's a warrant out for your arrest and things like that. So something coming from the FBI or something official coming from Microsoft saying your account's being shut down would be manipulating that authority principle. Social proof, obviously, being, all of the professors in your department have already done this and you better do this in a hurry. Consistency, of course, you've made several commitments, or they make you think you've made several commitments, and then they hit you with, why are you ignoring us? Liking is your congratulations, you are the most wonderful scholar, and we're inviting you to this conference, this parasite conference, and because of your brilliant work on such and such. And then, of course, scarcity, you have 24 hours, or you're getting locked out, or you have 24 hours, or you're going to miss out on this amazing bonus. Okay, so in developing these inoculation versus education is going to be our control group. We start with, of course, the threat that every day billions of emails are sent with one purpose, to gather your information. So then we hit them with more of a specific, you could be next type of thing, okay? And in contrast, we have an education manipulation, which is first we address why phishing is such a problem. Like a lot of crime, phishing uses blah, 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 blah. So they're similar introductions, but the phishing manipulation focuses more on threat. The education is literally an educational module that we developed. We pulled several sources for this educational module that we do. It has, I used one that we use at UNR, and I basically took the structure of it and created our own content, which more or less educates the same way. I've pulled from several internet resource sites and things like that. And so the inoculation looks something like this, okay? The first category is authority. Phishers are going to tell you that the email you're receiving is from authority figure. And then we go on to describe, there's no need to read this, but you go on to describe kind of they're taking advantage of the authority principle. This is how it's going to try to make you feel. This is how they're going to try to approach it. So we're giving them all the information behind the persuasion we're giving them the secret sauce, essentially, behind the persuasion and telling them this is what it's going to do, this is what it's going to make you feel. They're going to try to make you think that you're in trouble, and so on, and so on, and so on. And then we follow up with an example authority email, okay? And we repeat this for the 6 Cialdini principles and have a summary. In the education condition, we provide individuals with example emails, the same example emails, but we're just talking about, the mechanics of phishing and what it does and, how they're trying to get your information and don't click on things. So it's a pretty rigorous control condition in the sense that, we're trying to help in both conditions, right? And I had actually a collaborator ask me, why don't you just do a grocery list control group? So a lot of times in social personality psychology, we'll ask them to think about a summer vacation or, tell us about a grocery list that they're going to shop for later in that day to try to just get them to engage in a task that's unrelated. And I really wanted a rigorous kind of control group. Okay, so we ran about 100 people. And so this is underpowered. This is preliminary. I am not hanging my hat on this. We are moving forward with the NSF to grant to push this further. But as you can see, if you look at overall email caution, okay, so the ability to say, I delete immediately the email, inoculation only works among the high overconfidence folks, whereas education doesn't really matter whether it's high overconfidence or not. It's much more effective to use inoculation among the high overconfidence folks. But what's interesting is in the low overconfidence, this is a significant slope of inoculation. So you actually have a bit of an underperformance among low overconfident individuals. And so one of the things that might happen is inoculation among those individuals who are really knowledge insecure is you're inoculating them, but they don't know what you're talking about, right? They're missing the bare bones pieces of understanding what a phishing attack is. So in those cases, education outperforms inoculation. So one of the things that I think I take away from this is that a one-size-fits-all approach to phishing defense and cybersecurity is dead. I think one of the things we need to start doing is taking into account things like individual differences when we start tailoring phishing vulnerabilities to individuals. So overclaiming is a promising screening tool for those who may be vulnerable to phishing. And so I think overclaiming, because it is behavioral, because it is unfakeable, it is a valuable screening tool for figuring out who's most vulnerable to phishing because of that particular vector, right? So if you think about phishing attacks as being you have a surface area, as your whole psychology being an attack surface, right? There are different vectors in that attack surface, different holes in that attack surface that attackers can exploit. And one of those vectors is indeed overclaiming, or this thinking that you know concepts and things that you actually empirically could not know. And so overclaiming can be generalized and adapted to any topic or industry. One of the things that's really important about overclaiming too that few people know is it's unfakeable, which means that Del Paulis has done studies with his students where he sits down and says, there are fake items in here. There are fictitious items in this survey, and you still get, it reduces the overclaiming amount, but the highly, highly narcissistic individuals still insist they know concepts that are fictional, especially if you frame it in something that they are invested in psychologically, like if the student is a good student and narcissistic and you say this is an intelligence test or a test of knowledge in your given area, they will still insist they know these fictional concepts. It is a behavioral assessment, which is really nice. So it's not subject to the same issues of self-report that personality is subject to. So if we approach an organization or a group of individuals and we discuss using overclaiming as a potential screening tool, and they say, yeah, I read about it on the internet and I know exactly how to respond to get out of this training, or I know how to fake it. It's not fakeable because you can constantly regenerate new fictitious items and use new foils. So it is kind of a fluid measure. So the overclaiming scale that I have, which I'm happy to distribute to anybody here, it'll keep working if you keep coming up with realistic foils and just plug in new. I just chose 15 concepts. It was a very short measure of cybersecurity knowledge and fake concepts. So what's really nice about that is you can just keep plugging in new concepts and plugging in new foils, and the properties of the scale are going to continue to work the way they're supposed to. Ideally, with an overclaiming measure, you want, however, to hit people at very easy, moderate, and obscure levels of real concepts to try to differentiate if you're trying to get at real knowledge as well. So fuzzing, it's a concept I had never heard of as a psychologist, but I was at a meeting in Washington, D.C. for the Army Research Laboratory, and there was a gentleman that his research was all about fuzzing. And I to embarrass myself, I really can't remember even the concept. It was very kind of a complicated, obscure thing. So that's why I like to use it as a real item in the overclaiming, because most of my business students probably have never heard of it, but most of us have heard of zero-day attacks. That's in the fairly common in the everyday lay lexicon. So to be able to kind of use those more obscure versus moderate versus very common concepts mixed with the foils really provides a rich sense of what somebody knows and what they're exaggerating. Okay, so right now, as of today, it seems that inoculation to persuasion is a promising new direction in handling phishing defense. As I said, in this talk, I'm excited because this is the most hot off the presses stuff we're doing. We are currently planning to launch this summer our first round of manipulations, and then we're going to follow up with 3 weeks of pen testing for participants for our NSF grant. If anybody has a population or a sample that they're interested in using this on, please contact me. I'd be so excited to be collaborating with folks who would like to potentially test this, especially if you have access to a sample of, cybersecurity experts or folks who are potentially prone to this overclaiming phenomenon. So most especially, we expect overclaimers to respond positively to the inoculation manipulation. And our NSF grant right now involves a 4-group design. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at inoculation in isolation. We're going to look at education in isolation. We're going to look at a combination of the two, inoculation and education. And then we're going to have a control group where we give them virtually, literally nothing as a defense mechanism. And then we're going to spend 3 weeks, and this is where Rakesh and his students get involved, where we're also going to provide individuals with pen testing for 3 weeks. And over those 3 weeks, we're going to be giving them alerts in the emails that are either phishing related. So say, remember, we talked about this looks like a liking, and the principle of liking is blah, blah, blah. And so following the analogy, and maybe I'm torturing the analogy, but following the analogy of inoculation, one of the things we're thinking is it needs a booster shot once in a while. So that's where the alerts come in. Now, up to this point in the research literature, if somebody have software, natural learning, machine learning processes, where you hover your mouse over a link and a warning pops up and says, you may want to consider not clicking on this link and things like that, or this looks like a phishing email. But we are going to go a step further now and try to recognize the different 6 persuasion categories through natural language processing and provide an alert that says, hey, this looks like authority. And so not only does it tailor the alert to the individual email, but it could serve as a booster shot for the inoculation manipulation, if that makes sense. Okay, so more broadly, Dark Triad traits are valuable in studying approaches to attack and vulnerability as well. I'm not getting away from my Dark Triad research. I'm not getting away from looking at, especially sadism now. We have individuals who are hacking systems just to create chaos. I always go back to the famous case of the tornado sirens in Dallas at 3 a.m. I think this was 8 years ago. Somebody hacked the tornado system and set it off at 3 a.m. So everybody woke up and panicked. And I'm sure the individual who did that thought it was hysterical. I don't find those things funny. But these attacks for no other reason than to disrupt the system would most likely be associated with things like sadism, or everyday sadism as we call it. So that would be fascinating to me to continue to study. The Big Five, I had a great talk with one of our speakers, Arun, who was consistently pointing out that personality, like the Big Five, was ineffectual in a lot of these capturing individual differences and vulnerability. And I, as a personality psychologist, heartily agree that the Big Five is simply too broad. You have to look at individual dispositions that are prone to criminal behavior, like the Dark Triad, right? Like sadism. And then, of course, mimicry deception theory is a promising way to profile long versus short-term attacks and attackers. So I have a mimicry deception scale that captures the 4 components in self-report. We have a mimicry deception scale that captures the 4 components in peer report. So we've done studies looking at people who were victims of fraud, victims of deception, and we had them classify these individuals according to these 4 categories. And not only do the 4 categories correlate with each other as they should, they predict higher damage when there's long-term deception involved. My student out at Erasmus University Rotterdam in the Netherlands actually has a study that she's done with mimicry deception theory where we profiled child sex offenders. And again, the 4 patterns hold. Children who are abused over longer periods of time by somebody whom they know, by grooming the community, the kind of the coach or the scoutmaster or whatever the person involved in the community, tends to be these long-term mimics where the predators that are more of a puppy in the van, I have candy in my van types, tend to be the more short-term type deceivers. And so we can actually detect these grooming patterns. And if they fit the four-factor model of mimicry deception theory, then it's a big red flag. So mimicry deception theory does have the ability to assess self-report, but it doesn't require it. So we can look at patterns. of deception. One of the things that I'm also really interested in, and I've mentioned this with several cybersecurity experts, nothing's hit the ground running yet, is looking at coding approaches. So what kind of code do you write? How do you write code? And do you tend to be a long-term or short-term deceiver? So kind of looking back at successful hacks and how they code, and can we classify based on just their approach to coding. Okay, so that's all. I would like to thank my support system. I have several excellent graduate students, Deet Sabo and Yu Rong, who are working on my end with the inoculation research. There's Fatih, who is Rakesh Verma's graduate student. And I really want to thank Rakesh Verma, who has been kind of my lock arm collaborator on this whole time with the inoculation and phishing. And of course, Chris and Cleotide, Cody, have been invaluable in kind of indoctrinating me into the cybersecurity world. And my former grad students, of course, Jesse Correa and Shelby Curtis, who are both PhDs and on their way in their careers. And thank you.